Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Bey-Ling Shaw from California State University, Fullerton, and it's my honor this evening to be here with Richard Louie. How are you doing today, Richard?
It's great to see you, Bey-Ling.
Great. So, Richard, we have so much to talk about, and I'm just going to try to be quick while being thorough. You have been an MSNBC dayside anchor since September 2010, and before that, you spent 5 years at CNN Worldwide, including CNN Headline News as the solo anchor of the 10 a.m. hour of Morning Express. So in that role, you were the first Asian American male to anchor a daily national news broadcast in the United States. So if we could start with talking a little bit about being the first, which is something that I personally have a lot of conflicting feelings about. How do you think being the first Asian American male news anchor has impacted you or impacted other members of our community?
Bey-Ling, it was one of those things that my colleague, Melissa Long, when I told her, hey, by the way, I'm going to be moving on to anchor over at CNN Headline News, she said, well, Richard, you know. And I was like, no, I don't know. And she said, well, and it was in the back of my mind, but certainly not in the forefront of, not in the front of my brain. And I guess whatever, when you were talking about that, the first thing that comes to mind is why? Why in 2007? Why do we have so few today? I can probably count on less than one hand the number of folks that are Asian American male and anchoring on a national level. And that's a problem. What happened 15 years ago is still happening today. And so I'm not conflicted about the idea of it. I'm conflicted with the dynamics around it.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And also because sometimes when people talk about someone being the first, it's like, it's almost sometimes the implication like you got the position because of some demographic background, as opposed to just being excellent, right? And the fact of your demographics is incidental.
Yeah, I think in that case, yes. In other cases, no. And and I don't know the full answer. I just know that I saw that there was an MOU that listed my name under that for by the grace of the new company that was buying NBC Universal. They said we support diversity, and we're going to sign an MOU with the community, which is really amazing, by the way. And in the footnote of the MOU, where they said they were going to work to develop talent that were AAPI, as an asterisk, and there was Martin Bashir and myself, I believe. And then I was wondering, hey, was that the idea of a affirmative action hire? Now, I don't know the answer to that. I will know that in an MOU that was with the AAPI community, and then their therefore commitment to work on AAPI talent, that I was in there and happened to be around the same time I was hired. Either way, I'm grateful to have the job. I'm just grateful that I could be here for 12 years. They've been so kind to me along the way. I also know that even if it were to be affirmative action, so be it. It's now my job, once I walk through the door, to do my darndest, to do the best job I can. And there's one theory out there, Bey-Ling, which you may agree with or not, and I know you've heard it before, that affirmative action often implies that the talent that you do bring in, because that program is above the average. Because the very idea behind affirmative action is there are groups who underrepresented, number one, number two, kept back by the structures of the environment, and therefore they're kept back by the structures of the environment. Wouldn't they be possibly better than the average because they're held back, right? It's like you got that door closed, and then you open the door and you let them in finally. Well, whatever you agree with, there's all sorts of different ideas behind it, and whatever it was for me, Glad I've been able to be here and do my darndest. Um, and I mean, it's still tough. It's still real tough. The whole supply demand question, I answer it today completely different than I would have answered it to you 2 years ago, 5 years, 10 or 15 years ago.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Well, you know, if you and I were sitting around having coffee like we are now, um, by the way, you have much better background than I do. With look at all that greenery. What do
Spent more time setting it up, to be
I?
honest.
No, look what I got. I got I got shades. Um, if I go back 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, or 15, and I was asked that question often. What? Why aren't there more folks like you on network TV? And being a business person, because I was in business for 10, 15 years before I became a journalist, my answer would have been it's a supply and demand problem. I don't know the answer fully. We don't have enough supply and we don't have enough demand, right? I was pretty sure about that. You ask me today, I will tell you we do have a problem with supply, but the bigger problem is we have a problem with demand. There is nobody, zero, calling up a talent agent and saying, I'd like an Asian American male anchor. That call does not happen. There's a demand problem. There's an overlook of a problem. Look, I'm not a person quick to make this statement. I've waited 15 years to make this statement. We got a problem. And I don't know how to fix it, but now that I've had the data, watching very closely, there is no call. We have to make our own call. To make our own call to say these folks need to be on TV. And it's not a poor me, Bey-Ling. It's not a poor me. It is we work together, right? We work together no matter what community or background or industry. When we see that inequity, we do something.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to, Richard, is all the different facets of representation and where it is and also where it isn't, right? So when people think of representation in news media or any kind of media, often I think the first thing that comes to mind is representation that is visible, that is in front of the camera, that is on TV, that is in the show. And what you're speaking to is a different kind of representation, which we are also lacking, which is representation in the halls of power, representation at the tables where decisions get made, right? Because if more people gave thought to the diversity pipeline and supply and demand at the higher levels where they could actually make a difference, maybe we'd see faster results.
Yes. Look at the boardrooms.
Yeah.
Look at the CEOs that you're alluding to something I agree with. Not there. And look at those who are running all the major organizations and industries. Not there. Way underrepresented, underpaid, held back. It is through and through an issue. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I agree.
Well, there are some organizations like Asian American Futures where members of our community who have resources or who have access to resources are working together. Gold House is another example of pooling resources together to kind of leverage up members of the community. And I think it's organizations like that that really give me a lot of hope for the future, right?
The most important thing that's happening right now and over the last 2 years is um, a renaissance of the CBOs across the country that are looking at and focusing on the intersectionality of our country. And I'm heartened by the groups that over the years that I've been able to meet. And you're right, it is the CBO that if you're a Fortune 500, if you're a Russell 2000, and you've got some money you want to invest into how do we fix this issue of inequity in any community, look at your CBO. Look at the community-based organization where you are at or where you want to be at. Volunteer, join their boards, donate, 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 donate. That's the real work. It's not just money. It's smart money. And the smart money model is what we need right now because it's about the relationships and the understandings of the gaps and what we understand to be the culture of one group and of America. So yeah,
Yeah.
I am heartened by the CBOs that are popping up in every major city in the country. And we've had a lot since the Atlanta spa shootings. We've had a lot during the last 2 years of violence. And it is a renaissance. It is heartening. It is encouraging. And I, I, I just want to meet them all.
Yeah.
Right? It's just they've done so much.
Yeah, they're doing such important work. And actually, on the topic of community-based organizations, let me switch gears a little bit, right? Because there are so many different kinds of CBOs, like you say, and they do so much important work in communities of all kinds, not only in terms of getting more representation for people in the media, there's also community-based organizations working just to lift up communities on the ground, right? So I'm thinking, for example, with the pandemic, there have been some community-based organizations that are working really hard on the front lines of the pandemic to help out members of the community. And so one question that I had for you related to COVID, if we could switch to that topic a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the really clear, what to most people is a very clear health risk posed by COVID-19, there are people in linguistically isolated communities, right? Including many AAPI seniors who don't get a lot of exposure to mainstream news media. And so members of our linguistically isolated senior communities, they might be receiving inaccurate information about the pandemic, about vaccines that protect against the virus. I'm thinking specifically of a Vietnamese language radio show here in Southern California, whose information is not always fully accurate. So I'm wondering, in a culture where we traditionally defer to our elders, how can younger people convince older people to discount what they might be hearing or seeing in the news or on programs that are disseminated in our heritage languages, right? So how can we work with community-based organizations to protect our elders from the pandemic itself, but also from inaccurate information about the pandemic?
So that's a multi-layered answer. I'd say number one, work with them to find the sources of information that are good and spend that time with them. That's the first thing. Be a guide. We all should be doing that. I often ask the question, how much time do you spend every time you buy a new phone? Deciding which phone. Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Well, we should be doing the same about our sources of information and news. Sometimes we don't spend more than 30 seconds. But why wouldn't we do that every year? Like, what are the new, even if you want to be, entrepreneurial in terms of where you're getting your information, your news, spend the same amount of time you do deciding which new phone you should get. So that is something we can do to help our families, right? Older or younger, to get through that. I think the second thing is be a good storyteller yourself. Where are the three sources before you tell that story that you heard? Oh, I heard blah, blah, blah. I heard blah, blah, blah is not good enough. Are there two other sources that say that happened, right? Or it can't be just you hearing from me, Bey-Ling, right? You need to triangulate. That's what we do every day in journalism. I think that's a second way to help get good information into whether it's in language or not, or mainstream. It's the right way to do it. You can write, if you are in language, those stories. Better yet, you can also, if you're not, and it's your English and your family members in language, is to have them help you translate it together, right? And to them post that story. That's a big commitment, you'll find, to, well, report on stuff accurately. And it underlines one of the often overlooked things about journalism. Facts are not cheap. And we have come to believe we get facts at a very low price, if not for free. That's not true. And one of the statistics I bring up often, according to Reporters Without Borders, is we lose anywhere from, it used to be in 60, 70 journalists a year were killed, murdered across the world. We in the last year had 45, roughly in the 40s. But this has been consistent for decades. Facts are not cheap. And if you live in the United States, we should feel great honor that the majority who die, the journalists, not the honor that they died, the honor that they look to us as that golden mountain of what it could be to have true free speech. They do that. It is so heartening to know that we have it here available to us and we don't take advantage of it, which is, as you know, the bedrock of why we are the country we are.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
I've seen these other journalists and heard their stories about giving up their life trying to tell the truth. And I'm only a millionth of the heart that they have.
Yeah. You must have seen a lot of that when you worked in Asia as well, right? Reporters who were trained in different traditions and came from different backgrounds. And they really envy the press freedoms that we have in the United States. I think Trevor Noah this weekend made a similar point at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that American journalists have such a huge responsibility in the world because we in this country have the First Amendment and we are able to speak truth to power.
We are. And Maria Ressa, a great Asian working in the Philippines who got the Pulitzer Prize for her super work of trying to find truth and founding an organization. And she was honored by the Asian American Journalists Association for her years of work. And she puts her life on the line. But yes, Asia, in fact, my first anchoring gig was at Channel News Asia in Singapore, which ranks in the bottom 20% for media freedom. And that's where I started. It was a very good lesson. But yeah, I didn't think in the last 10 years I'd be mentioning the Constitution, First Amendment, freedom of speech, the honor it is to be a journalist and that it's not work, it's really a way of life. That's also what's surprising to me, Bey-Ling, because before that I was, a business person and worked for startups, and I didn't necessarily say that was defining in my true core. But being a journalist is has become a real way of life for me, and the way I see things and the way I try to talk about things.
Yeah. And what I really appreciated about your advice, in response to my original question in terms of how can we help the elders in our community to get good information, is you're basically saying that we should empower the members of our own community to find the correct facts, right? We can't all be journalists on TV, but we can all do our work in terms of consuming information, in terms of sharing information with the same due diligence of working journalists on the ground.
And in fact, it is, you're right. It's all these different levels, Bey-Ling, because when you think about what happened in Atlanta a year ago on March 16th, the journalists that really brought out the story were the in-language, in-community journalists. It was not journalists like me. It was the ones that were in language. It was the Korean newspapers in language that knew who, what, where, when, why, and how. And those are the ones I was so grateful to have a connection to, because of living there for 5 years before. They were the ones that made it happen. And so it is. It's a complete ecosystem, especially when it comes into multi-generational communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me talk a little bit about that, actually, since you mentioned the school shootings from a year ago. And then there have just been so much, it seems, especially since the pandemic, there has been so much violence directed against persons of Asian heritage. And in your recently published book, Enough About Me, you mentioned that your own father, right, had been attacked.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm wondering, in the book, you talked about how it wasn't something, the attack wasn't something that he wanted to talk about or that you wanted to talk about. And in this AAPI Heritage Month, it's our opportunity to share our culture. And it's also an opportunity for allies and accomplices to take extra time to learn about AAPI culture. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, for people trying to better understand our culture during this Heritage Month, can you talk a little bit about that, about why it seems sometimes in our cultural background or heritage, there are things that happen that seem so important, and yet we don't want to talk about them?
Yeah, not wanting to talk about these stories might be for various reasons. Um, we are afraid. Um, we are humble, or not we as a group, but you might be afraid, you might be humble, you might be scared. You may not have the tools. All of these things are dynamic and I think existent in our community, just like many other communities. Um, the one thing on the flip side is, do you celebrate in your community or in your family standing out? Do you celebrate speaking up for the truth? Do you celebrate collegiality in that expression? If you speak out, do I support you, Bey-Ling? Or do I go, oh boy, she's kind of, talking a lot? Or what about Richard? Boy, he loves to toot his horn a lot, doesn't he? Um, and I think it is, I'm no sociologist, but I always try to answer the question the way that it's asked, best of my ability and my 2 cent opinion. It is for those who did not have English multiple generations before, exposed to that immigrant group or to that origin country, it is more difficult. I mean, if you look at those from areas that have not seen, and I'll bring up some that have not. I mean, Cambodia, Laos, China. There's 3 examples of countries in Asia that didn't. Malaysia, who have not had a lot of exposure necessarily. Malaysia has more English exposure. You look at India, you look at Korea, you look at Japan and the Philippines, who have had the unfortunate exposures sometimes to things as severe as colonialism. That the benefit today is the assimilative arc has been heightened, peaked, right? Increased in steepness. And all of these things come back to why today, multi generations in, why or why not would you not want to confront what fact is? And it is a lot of things baked in. I do believe that's part of it, because if you look at the ability for our South Asian brothers and sisters to do so well in politics and in media, which is definitely a raise the hand kind of industries, they do well, I do believe, because of the difficult times before, right? Colonialism in South Asia was like, but on the flip side, that assimilative process is 100 years old and more. So there's a lot of deep answers to the question: why don't we stand up, and why don't we value that stand up quality? If you were to make that an overall generalization, I do know what you're talking about, though.
Um, So you mentioned the importance of celebrating ourselves. And I think sometimes when we do that, members of our own community are like, shh, be quiet. Why are you celebrating yourself? Just keep your head down and keep doing the work. And sometimes it's the members who are not AAPI who step in as allies or accomplices to celebrate us. So I'm wondering for, our viewers today, for people who want to support their AAPI friends and colleagues and students, do you have any concrete recommendations for things to do or say, or things not to do or not to say?
I do believe the best way of understanding what allyship might be is, like anything we do, is to do a little homework. Do I want to be asked when I first meet you, or we meet again, and what's it like to be Asian? What is a good Asian restaurant? That you can think of the number of questions. Or what do you think of that Asian actor? And I think the way to understand the sensitivities and nuances of those types of conversations about race and equity is to read to do the things that we would do with any other topic. If you were going to change careers and move into computer engineering, what would you do? You'd probably do some research, right, before you start going to conferences and going to looking at CE and just CEs, excuse me, just saying hello, or industrial engineers and just saying hello and asking the questions that wouldn't be as efficacious if you had done a little homework. So I think in the space of allyship, no matter what the group is, go and read Ebony, go and read NBC BLK, go and read NBC Latino and Next Shark and Asian Am and NBC Asian America. Do that. Then come and talk to me. And ask me anything you want. I'm not against you asking the most difficult questions. I will share that with you. Not everybody will do that, or not everybody does that for a living. So do some studying, do a little reading. If you want to be an ally, start to understand what we're living through.
Mm-hmm. And I think another part of that too, that you alluded to, and I'll just put it a little bit differently, is to acknowledge that we're holistic people beyond just our racial background, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You can talk to us about other things. Like, people can invite us to speak on panels that are not about diversity, right? Yeah. We have other things to contribute also.
And that's a real important point. I want to underline, Bey-Ling, in that what we've seen, I think, in news in the last 2 years is we are having Asian American Pacific Islander guests on TV that aren't talking about being Asian American Pacific Islander and in force. And that is so important. And you bring up that very rich idea of intersectionality, and that we do bring all of it into what we do. You do, I do, but we're not only one of those things all the time. Sometimes we're one, sometimes we're two, sometimes we're three, sometimes we're none. Just because I look like this doesn't mean I'm always this. Just because I talk about this topic now, today, does not mean that's the only topic that I enjoy talking about.
Right. That's right. So one thing that I do want to ask you is, when we think about all the different aspects of our identity and balancing those different parts, there is, for example, our racial identity, our gender identity, our professional identity. And for professional communicators, there is an additional burden, right, in this talking about representation. Public relations practitioners are often responsible for monitoring media coverage as part of their jobs. Journalists like yourself, have to report on violence, on racial violence as part of their jobs, as you did in the 90s, covering the Rodney King verdict and the racial unrest that followed. So how do you balance protecting your personal health and well-being as a human, covering topics that are emotionally close to us, while still doing the job that you have to do professionally?
Well, we got to check in, right, Bey-Ling? And I'm just learning that in the caregiving for my father over the last 8, 9 years, where I thought I was fine all the way through, um, and after he passed at the end of December, I was finishing my second documentary that's about mental health, and I was like, well, am I okay? Were there times where I wasn't okay? Probably. Am I okay now? I think I am, but if I'm not, that's okay too. And it's okay to say I'm not okay out loud. And I try to think through it, like what am I going through now? It's been, 4 months since he's gone, and I spent so much of my time, and I enjoyed every moment. I did. It continues to give me so much. So I think stopping in and checking to see if you're okay. And I write about it in the book where we lay out a chapter that it's okay to understand that there is such thing as giving too much. There is such a thing of unmitigated selflessness, that you give too much for others, you give too much for your job, you give too much to an idea, that you need to take a step back, and you notice it through your health, you notice it through your temper, you notice it through your eating habits, you notice it through your addictive qualities. All these things come to bear. And so when we are pushing like the topics of that are so important to us and we live it, whether it is working, thinking about our community and fighting for this community or our family or our job, it is absolutely fine, just like our physical health, to consider our emotional health. But we don't talk about it because we say, "Oh, how's your emotional health?" And you say, "Well, yeah, it's been kind of tough." People go, "Oh, are you crazy? Are you okay?" And the reality is, just like we're worried about, you know, me being physically healthy and doing my exercises, it's just as acceptable to say the same thing about our emotional health. And when I say I'm out of physical health, does it mean that I'm ready to fall over tomorrow? It doesn't. Does it mean I can run a marathon? It doesn't. It's a lot of stuff in between.
I think you raised a really good point, Richard, about mental health, because the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently, their most recent study indicated that suicide is the second leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 24 in this country. And for Asian Americans between the ages of 15 and 24, intentional self-harm is actually the leading cause of death, right? And in our community, we don't often talk about mental health and trauma, and that it's okay to not be okay, and that we should get help, right? Like, I don't talk about how I was bullied in middle school. I mean, you share very publicly in your book how that happened to you. And I think it's okay for people who are now in positions like ours, or people who even aren't in positions like ours, to just check in with each other and to say, you know what, Richard, I'm having kind of a really hard day. Can we do this interview tomorrow, right? Or, I mean, not that we would for this particular interview, but you know what I mean, to just be
Yeah, I do.
supportive of each other and to check in with each other.
Yeah, and I, I just learned something when you were talking about the statistics about our community of a certain age group, and that's so frustrating. Um, and checking in and actively pursuing the plan, just like we get trainers to think about how do we train to maintain our emotional health. Again, this is just everyday practitioner, not an expert, um, like you, Bey-Ling, who understands this stuff. I was just looking as we were writing the book and working with researchers and experts to say, we got to do this. This is just a journalist approach to it, right? What we do is we go out and look for the facts and try to lay it out. But yeah, I completely agree with you and I haven't figured that out, by the way. I haven't figured out how to talk
No,
about it yet.
No, and I should disclose as a disclaimer, my research is not mental health. It's just something I've been thinking a lot about lately because clearly we all need to spend more time on that. My research is actually about identity and public relations. And so in the couple minutes that we have left, I'd like to ask you a final question about identity because I'm just fascinated by how people come to realize who they are, right? And in your book, you share how your real family name is Wong, not Louis. In our conversation today, we have talked about the ways in which communities see us, the ways in which we see ourselves. We've talked about mental health. We have talked about representation. I'm wondering, whatever our names, our histories, our generational cultural traumas and our celebrations, our families, I think what all people have in common at the end of the day is one fundamental yearning, which is to have a sense of self, right? To know who we are in this world. So in our last 2 minutes, Richard, what suggestions would you give to our viewers about how to go about fulfilling that lifelong quest?
Whoa. Well, you're better equipped to answer that question. I would just say, based on my experience of going through the book writing process and my own caregiving and understanding why I would want to do it, would be to spend a lot of time writing down who you are and where you come from, what your name is and where the name came from, um, where your parents came from, why they made the decisions they did. Why did they decide to move there? Why did they choose that profession? Why decide to get married? Why decide to have you? Um, and writing it down has been so reflective uh, for me and so empowering. Um, I reflect back on, like, I write about my grandfather, like, why did he come here? Why did this guy do that? Um, it was a time where he had to come here illegally. It is a time where he bought the name Louis, that he's really a Wong. And, it's because he wanted a better future for himself and for his kids and grandchildren and all of thereafter. And as you know, what I write is I say, thank you, Grandpa. Thank you. Your grandson became a news anchor nationally, and you were a poor farmer from a little town in the south of China. And I would have been that too. He did not want me to be a poor Chinese farmer. And I say, I never met him, but thank you. I'm not a poor Chinese farmer.
Let me close with this. It's been said that we read to understand others and we write to better understand ourselves. And so for our audience, I would just say, read Richard's book so you can understand the heritage that so many members of our communities have, but also write your own book so that your story can be shared and that
Yes.
future generations can thank you, just like Richard and I thank our ancestors for making the decisions that they made that enabled us to be here today to have this very privileged conversation.
I can't thank you enough, Bey-Ling.
Thank you, Richard.